So hey guys, welcome to Learn with Rahul. So today we are going to talk about Hard Times by Charles Dickens. So before I start, I have a request for you guys. Please subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. Your subscription will be a huge motivation for me. So let's start. Hard Times for These Times, commonly known as Hard Times, is the 10th novel by Charles Dickens, first published in 1854. The book surveys English society and satirizes the social and economic conditions of the era. Hard Times is unusual in several ways. It is by far the shortest of Dickens' novels, barely a quarter of the length of those written immediately before and after it. Also, unlike all but one of his other novels, Hard Times has neither a preface nor illustrations. Moreover, it is his only novel not to have scenes set in London. Instead, the story is set in the fictitious Victorian industrial Choketown, a generic northern English mill town, in some ways similar to Manchester. Though smaller, Choketown may be partially based on 19th century Preston. One of Dickens' reasons for writing Hard Times was that sales of his weekly periodical, Household Words, were low, and it was hoped the novel's publication in installments would boost circulation, as indeed proved to be the case. Since publication, it has received a mixed response from critics. Critics such as George Bernard Shaw and Thomas Macaulay have mainly focused on Dickens' treatment of trade unions and his post-industrial revolution pessimism regarding the divide between capitalist mill owners and undervalued workers during the Victorian era. F.R. Leavis, a great admirer of the book, included it, but not Dickens' work as a whole, as part of his great tradition of English novels. Now let's talk about Charles Dickens. Charles John Hooman Dickens, 7 February 1812 to 9 June 1870, was an English writer and social critic. He created some of the world's best known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. His works enjoyed unprecedented popularity during his lifetime, and by the 20th century, critics and scholars has recognized him as a literary genius. His novels and short stories are still widely read today. Now let's talk about the summary of Hard Times. Mr. Gradgrind is a man of facts and calculations. He identifies a student called girl number 20, who replies that her name is Sissy Jupe. Gradgrind corrects her that her name is Cecilia, regardless of what her father calls her. Jupe's father is involved in a horse riding circus, and this is not respectable in Gradgrind's opinion. He advises Cecilia to refer her father as a farrier, the person who shoes a horse, or perhaps a veterinary surgeon. Sissy Jupe is a slow learner among the group of strugglers who admit that they would dare to carpet a room with representations of flowers because she is fond of them. Sissy is taught that she must not fancy, and that she is to be in all things regulated and governed by fact. Mr. Joseph Bounderby is Mr. Gradgrind's closest friend, and just like Gradgrind, he is a man perfectly devoid of sentiment. Boundary is very wealthy. Bounderby is very wealthy from his trade as banker, a merchant, and a manufacturer, among other things. He has an imposing figure, and his entire body is oversized, swelled, and overweight. He calls himself a self-made man, and he always tells his friends the Gradgrind's primarily stories of how he grew up in most wretched conditions. Mrs. Gradgrind has a very emotional temperament and she usually faints whenever Mr. Boundary tells his horror stories of being born in a ditch or having lived the first 10 years of his life as a vagabond. Mr. Gradgrind is at first hesitant, but he soon agrees. Uh, the boundary with Cecilia must be removed from the school so that she might not infect the other students with her ideas. He and Bounderby find Cici and proceed towards the public house where she lives to deliver the news. The other members of the performing group also live in the public house and they try to explain to Cici that her father has abandoned her. She has not left out of ill will, but because he thinks that she will have a better life without him guardian, as her guardian. It was with this intention that he had her enrolled in Mr. Gradgreen's school. Mr. Bounderby is morally engaged that a man would actually desert his own daughter. She has no other family in the world. Hooman is in his room and she is apparently someone that he knows. As the chapter ends, she laughs at Stepan scornfully. She has returned from some part of the past to ruin his life and give him even more to worry about. She passes out in a drunken stupor and Stepan is left to his misery. Mr. Gradgrind prepares to have his serious discussion Lucia, with Lucia, who insists upon remaining dispassionate throughout the entire encounter. Gradgrind tells his daughter that she is the subject of a marriage proposal and Lucia does not respond. Gradgrind expects Lucia to convey some emotion, but she is entirely stoic and reminds Gradgrind that her upbringing has prevented her from knowing what emotions to express. Gradgrind explains that it is Mr. Bounderby who has made the marriage proposal and Lucia refrains from registering any emotional response. When her father asks her what she intends to do, Lucia turns the question back to him and asks him what he thinks she ought to do. Gradgrind looks at the situation analytically and dismisses the fact of Boundary being 50 years old. The marriage has little to do with love and is simply a matter of tangible fact. In the end, the decision is for Lucia to make, but as she does not see that any opportunity will bring her happiness, she realizes that it does not matter what she does. She continually repeats the phrase, "What does it matter?" and this frustrates Mr. Gradgrind. In the end, Lucia is still emotionless and she replies, "I am satisfied to accept this proposal." Mr. Gradgrind is very pleased and he kisses his daughter on the forehead. When Mrs. Gradgrind hears the news, she is happy, but then she walks herself into a fit and soon passes out. Sissy Jupe is present and she is perhaps the only one who is able to sense the difference in Lucia. Lucia keeps herself at a distance and is impassive, proud and cold. Sissy feels a mixture of wonder, pity and sorrow for Lucia. Mr. Gradgrind is hiring the stranger, Mr. James Harthouse, as an instructor of his school. In his school, he will be one of many who are trained in logic and statistics and eager to help relieve children of their imaginations. James Harthouse is the younger brother of a member of parliament and as he has become an adult, he has failed to find a vocation or even a steady hobby to fill his hours. After trying several other things, Harthouse decided that he might as well give statistics a try, and so he had himself coached and instructed in various philosophies. Meanwhile, Tom Gradgrin has become quite wayward despite his rigors of his education, and he is incredibly hypocritical and disrespectful. He makes no efforts to hide his decision from Mr. Bounderby, as even as he fascinated by Mr. Harthouse's flashy clothes, and he befriends him for his largely superficial lessons. Tom very quickly becomes a pawn of Mr. Harthouse. After a little alcohol and some tobacco, Tom is loose-lipped and uninhibited to his criticism of Mr. Bounderby. At one point, Tom goes as far as to say that he is the only person that Lucia cares about, and that it is only for his well-being that she agreed to marry Mr. Bounderby. Without realizing it, Tom is lying in the seats for potential affair between the Harthouse and his sister. As Harthouse becomes more enwrapped without Lucia, Tom offers more and more secrets until he finally falls into a stupor. Stepan Blackpool is in the company of Mr. Bounderby, Lucia, Mr. Harthouse, and Tom. Mr. Bounderby intends to make an example of Stepan and present him to Mr. Harthouse as a sort of pessimism as a sort of specimen of his lower classes. Bounderby does not appreciate Stepan's criticism, and on him he decides to repay Stepan's loyalty by accusing him of being disloyal. He goes as far as to say that Stepan has betrayed both of his employer and his fellow employees, and his caps his argument off by firing Stepan for a novelty. Mrs. Sparsit reaches from her post at the bank, and then, when the timing is right, she hesitantly makes her way to the country house, and sure enough, she finds Lucia and James sitting in a garden together. He confesses his love, but Lucia remains resistant. He implores her to at least commit to seeing him, but she refuses. He suggests a change of venue and the entire time. Mrs. Sparsit, hidden behind the scarves, gloats to herself that the two young people have no idea that they are being watched. Harthouse leaves, and Lucia soon follows Mrs. Sparsit. That Lucia has eloped, and they have a planned meeting place, and so she trails Lucia as best as he can. It is raining, and Mrs. Sparsit is already dirty and muddy from hiding and crawling through the bus. Sparsit follows Lucia to the train station and thinks that Lucia has hired a coachman to get her cooked down faster. But after a few moments, Sparsit sees that she is incorrect. Lucia has boarded some train. I have lost her, is Mrs. Sparsit's explanation to defeat and frustration. Mrs. Sparsit is still steering up trouble. All of her running back and forth in the night-time rain has caused her to get a violent cold, but this does not stop her from completing her mission. She went as far as London to find Mr. Bounderby and confront him with the news of Lucia's conversation in the garden and her flight from the country house, presumably to continue her romantic affair. After giving the news, Mrs. Sparsit collapses in an incredibly theatrical display. Bounderby brings her back to Cooktown, and he carries her along with him to Stone Lodge, where he intends to confront Mr. Gradgrin, unaware that Lucia is also at Stone Lodge. Mrs. Sparsit's story is presented, and Mr. Gradgrin confesses that he is already aware of these details and that Lucia has preserved her honor by returning to her father's house when she did not know how to defend herself from temptation of her own. Mrs. Sparsit is now considered in the worst light, for she has cast aspersions and criticized Lucia without due cause. She can do little more than utter an apology and begin crying profoundly. profusely and she is sent back to town. Lucia and her father are both convinced that Tom is involved in a bank theft, and Lucia correctly suspects that after she left Stefan's room, Tom made some sort of false offer to Stephen in her name, encouraging him to loiter outside of the bank. Mr. Gradgrin agrees that Tom has properly done this, knowing that Stephen planned to leave town and would be the most logical suspect. In the moment of despair, again it is Sissy who has orchestrated, orchestrated a plan for deliverance and rescue. She could easily see that Tom was guilty and she sent him to Mr. Sleary and her old friends who were only a few towns away. Tom said that he had very little money and he did not know who could hide him, and this was the most reasonable solution as Sissy had read of the circus in the paper just a day before. It is also favorable that the town is only a few hours from the port of Liverpool, and Mr. Gradgrin hopes that he might be able to get his son passage on a ship that will send him far away from shame and punishment. So that's all for today, guys. I hope this video will be a great help for you. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. So love you guys, take care, bye, over and out.